Welcome as we join along in this particular dispensation. So without wasting a lot of time, you check your programs, you will see that we're slightly behind schedule. So without further ado, I would want us to proceed on with our Mr. Peter Musimi from the Kenya Law Reform Commission, and he's going to bring to us a presentation of the regulatory impact statements of the draft building code regulations. That's the National Building Code 2022. So let's put our hands together for Peter Musimi.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Peter Musimi. I work with the Kenya Law Reform Commission. I'm Acting Director, Legislative Services, and Head of Legal in that commission. We have been working as a team to develop the regulatory impact assessment. And this is what I'm going to be presenting to you in the next couple of minutes. This document is in the website of the authority. I want to believe most of you have had an occasion to look at the document together with the draft regulations that form the building code, because in a presentation like this, all I would do is just to highlight the most important aspects. But for you to be able to appreciate it fully, I would urge that once you get time, if you have not had, find time to read the whole document, which is part of the documentation you can download in the website. So I'm going to begin by, first of all, explaining what a regulatory impact assessment, which is also called a regulatory impact statement. What is it? Why do we need it? And at what time in point should we be talking about developing it? In terms of international practice, in the area of making laws, regulatory impact assessment has become a very important tool that is used by majority of countries to be able to assess the effects, the benefits, the costs, and the impact of any proposed legislation. In other words, because I'm very much aware that you know what an environmental impact assessment is, and why it is done during or before conducting a major infrastructural development. It is simply the same thing when it comes to development of a legal instrument. In other words, before you develop a legal instrument, you are first of all required to sit down and assess what are the impact of that legislation or proposed legislation, so that by the time you embark on it, implementing it, it does not occasion what are called unintended effects. And the idea here is to make sure that we do not over-regulate, or we do not have so many laws in place whose intention is not realizable, because sometimes people say that if the only tool you have is a hammer, then you think every problem should be solved by that thing. So for us lawyers, we may think that every problem is solvable by enactment of a law, and that may not be the case. So the purpose of a regulatory impact assessment or statement is to assess also other options of going about resolving any problem that might might be there. And that is why we need it. It is intended for policy decision makers so that they can make an informed decision, knowing that if they recommend that you go about this problem by enacting a certain law, then they know its full impacts. And therefore, it is a tool that informs decision. It is an assessment of the impact of policy option in terms of costs, benefits, as well as risks that might be there. It requires that regulations must be introduced only when other options are not viable. In other words, there is a place where you consider the different options of addressing a certain problem. We are going to look at the problem, we see what the problem is, but then you have to analyze what are the options apart from legislation. And I'll be coming to that because I'll be talking about even the option of doing nothing, the option of putting in place administrative measures, the option of self-regulation and so forth, before we consider the option of making a document with legal impact like the statutory instrument. It is also designed to assist in developing of legislations. It is supposed to assist policymakers to make informed decisions because it provides a systemic and consistent as well as well-informed decisions or way of making decisions. It is done, you may ask, what is the best time to do RIA? It has been done, in most cases, it is done as early as possible, even when you are developing the proposed regulation itself. And that is what we did, actually, even when the National Building Code was in the process of being formulated. We also started developing the regulatory impact statement so that we took into account all the steps that were involved. By way of a background, if you look at, and I've said that regulatory impact statement is not an old feature in lawmaking. It is fairly recent, but it has been adopted by so many countries, particularly the developed countries in the OECD, the developed countries like America, UK. In Africa, you will find South Africa, Zimbabwe, Ghana, and many other countries have long adopted a regulatory impact assessment before Kenya did. In 2013, that is when Kenya legislated in this important aspect. And the idea was this. The idea was to make sure that every time you bring legislation, and particularly subsidiary legislation, it is developed with the holistic approach so that you are able to address so many things that are not in, that are going to be impacted upon by that particular legislation. And I will give an example which I believe contributed a lot in terms of determining this. Most of you know that M-Pesa, our money mobile industry, is one industry that began sometime in the absence, largely in the absence of a legal framework. And so many lessons were learned in this aspect because it is the industry that was allowed to innovate. And once they innovate, they were protected by central bank by then. And within a short time, the industry grew by bounds. And in fact, it became the world-renowned industry that it is. When this industry was, when there were efforts to replicate it in other jurisdictions, which had more superior legislation, sometimes, and I'll give an example of South Africa, for instance. When M-Pesa was taken to South Africa, you know, it took a short time before it was realized that it could not proceed, and actually the efforts were abandoned somehow. People looked at this, and the same happened in many other countries. People looked at it and said, well, could it be that then it is what we call developed legal framework that inhibited the growth of this industry? And I think these are lessons and scholarly issues that need to be looked at deeply. And this is where regulatory impact assessment came in, and that is when Parliament, in its wisdom, thought that they needed to put a law to the effect that particularly the statutory instruments, and by statutory instruments I mean laws that are below the Acts of Parliament. You know, in terms of hierarchy of laws in Kenya, we have the Constitution, which is the supreme law. We have Acts of Parliament, which are enacted by Parliament. And then we have statutory instruments that come in form of regulations. This is the ambit of the Statutory Instruments Act. And what the Statutory Instruments Act requires is that if you are making any regulation or any instrument with the force of law that is going to significantly affect any part of Kenya, section of the population or the country as a whole, then you are required to do a regulatory impact assessment. And therefore, the Act goes up again further in terms of saying what should be the elements of that or the contents of that statutory instrument. And this is what we have been careful to make sure that it is captured in the statement that we have developed. So, what are the benefits of developing a RIA or a RIS statement for any particular instrument? First of all, it is able to clearly articulate the problem that you are solving. In other words, you don't just develop a regulation for the sake of developing a regulation. You have to do it with a purpose. And that purpose has to be in terms of you are addressing a certain problem. Because the idea is simply not to have a regulation for the sake of it. So you, first of all, developing a RIA helps you to clarify and clearly articulate the problem. It is able to offer a range of options which you can adopt to address that problem. And the first option is usually doing nothing. It can be administrative measures. It can be use of economic instruments. It can be promoting self-regulation depending on the nature of the industry. Or it can even be introducing an industry code of practice or conduct. It can take any form. And in this regulatory impact assessment, we have been able to assess a number of options. And we have recommended the development of a national building code in form of regulations to be the best option. Another advantage of conducting a RIS is that it is able to explicitly justify the recommended regulatory measure. That is, by analyzing all the other options and giving reasons why you are taking a certain measure, you are able to justify, even before the decision makers, the reason why you are taking the option that you are taking. It also focuses on consultation with the stakeholders, because this is a requirement of the Statutory Instruments Act. You are able to get the input of stakeholders in the document that you are developing. Again, it also promotes accountability of government actions, because it would be a situation whereby someone sits in a desk in a certain office and develops a framework and says this is good enough because I'm a professor and I think this is good for the country. But in terms of governance, of course, it has to be open and it has to be seen to be involving the people who are affected by that. So it is able to, again, afford this kind of transparency and consultative inclusiveness, so to speak. And finally, it helps identify and hopefully avoid the unintended effects of regulation. Unintended effects is something that affects many, many regulations in terms of you have developed a set of regulations, you want to promote a certain industry. But unknown to you, that set of regulations actually incorporates a lot of bureaucracy. And instead of actually promoting what you were aiming to promote, you end up actually being restrictive or being an hindrance to that kind of business. So basically, there has been that consideration in developing the building code to make sure that it is facilitative of the construction industry in Kenya, and it is not going to operate as an hindrance by itself. That has been considered. Again, regulatory impact statement, the purpose for which it is being developed, and the objectives. What I can emphasize as a purpose or the main aim why these regulations are being promulgated is that they are going to promote order, they are going to promote safety of the people, they are going to promote good health of persons, and they are also going to promote the construction industry generally. Of course, this is done by the components of different aspects of the code, which will be presented to you in detail in the coming presentations. But in a nutshell, some of the things that it provides for, you'd find that it has provided for design of buildings, construction, operation, inspection, and maintenance of those buildings. It also provides for standards of building materials. It provides for such things like systems and services, standards of infrastructure, standards for operation and works at construction site, disaster management, and safety, as well as security of the users of and the occupants of the buildings when they are constructed. Basically, it deals with the construction site when you are constructing, as well as safety of the users after we have the construction is over, and even beyond enduring the maintenance of the buildings. I want now to look at the problem that I'm happy to point out that some of the aspects of the problem had been pointed out, particularly by the executive director when he was making his opening remarks. And therefore, I'm not going to dwell on them in details. Granted, to understand the fact that what we are applying today is a 1968 document called the Building Code that was developed under the Local Government Act then. Local Government Act was the law that was dealing or establishing municipalities and so forth. And therefore, they developed this as a bylaw under that act, and it was adoptive bylaw, which means that different municipalities were able to determine whether to adopt it to make it part of their law or not. And therefore, much as it was not mandatory, it was only mandatory in certain municipalities. And therefore, by way of its operation, even then, you'd find that its implementation was not uniform. It was only applied in big cities like Nairobi, Mombasa, and so forth. But in other places, it was completely unknown, except when they were constructing a public building or some sort of thing. So, the Local Government Act, Cap 265, when the Constitution of Kenya was enacted in 2010, of course, the Constitution established county governments instead of those councils. And therefore, this was one of the acts that was recommended for repeal. And it was repealed immediately after the Constitution came into operation. But what Chapter 2, of the laws of Kenya, that is Interpretation and General Provisions Act, provides is that if a law is repealed, and under that law there were regulations which had been issued, those regulations are supposed to stay in operation until they are revoked by a similar instrument. And therefore, here comes a document whose mother has died and it remains in force. Of course, it was not very clear at that time even which agency of government was supposed to be dealing or enforcing it. And therefore, you can see the problem that arose out of it. And that was a problem until the change of law some few years ago, when it was properly placed under the national construction industry. We shall come to see that. So the 1968 code has been in place, as was pointed out correctly, for over 50 years now. And if you imagine 50 years in a construction industry, it changes a lot. You can imagine Nairobi 50 years from now. 50 years back. You could think of which was the tallest building, what kind of buildings were in place. And now, of course, things have been very dynamic. The construction industry has changed a lot. And we are still expected to retain the same provisions that had been put in place so long time ago. This can't happen, and that is why we were saying that some of the provisions have now become obsolete, meaning that is part of the problem. Again, it was pointed out that there are certain international standards. Like in the case of Europe, we have what we call Euro codes, which are 10 sets of building standards that deal with how structural issues about buildings are supposed to be done. And the Euro codes, because they are a good set of structural designs, they have been adopted all over the world by many countries. And countries do this by way of changing their laws and saying that we have adopted Euro code number this and that for purposes of this. But in Kenya, that has never happened because our 1968 orphaned regulations have been there. They have not been able to be repealed because somehow nobody was taking responsibility over them. And therefore, that opportunity of applying those international standards was missed. And therefore, what they only recognize are the standards that are set out under our Standards Act and nothing to do with the international standards. You will see when the code will be presented that it now has adopted the Euro codes, and we are able now to compare with the rest of the international community in terms of these areas. Again, the system of measurement was mentioned. We all know that the international system of measurement in terms of length is meters, like it is kilograms in terms of weight and many others. But we still use feet and inches in terms of building material. And therefore you find these are not internationally recognized. So if someone makes a BQ and this material is going to be procured in another jurisdiction, you see there are going to be problems of, first of all, conversion and so forth and so forth. So the new code now is adopting an international system of measurement, the meter, and therefore it's becoming internationally recognized, and we'll be able to interact very well with even outside markets. Again, it was explained that the code tends to recognize the traditional building materials, stones, bricks, mortar, and so forth. It does not take into account the building technologies that have developed internationally and or even encouraged others locally. It does not, for instance, recognize that this country is endowed with a lot of natural resources, such as limestone, gypsum, clay, coral reefs, forest products, and so forth and so forth. If this is to be recognized, again, it will be a way of boosting our industry through utilization of natural resources, not necessarily to rely on imports of construction, and this is a problem by itself. The question of enforcement and compliance, it is like the code has not been fully implemented because its enforcement is a problem. This is a law that was targeted to be implemented by local governments. Now we are talking about county governments, which are distinct and which do not necessarily receive instructions or orders from a single ministry. They make their own decisions, and therefore there is that problem of implementing certain aspects, even though there are certain aspects of the code which are good, but the problem of implementing and enforcement is a problem. And therefore, you find that implementing this code, again, and this is part of the problem still, has resorted to certain, or has brought about certain gaps that if you compare similar codes, international codes with ours, you'd find ours lacking in certain aspects. And one of the things that it is lacking in is a provision, and I was happy to hear that persons with disabilities are represented here. The persons with disabilities are not recognized under the code, and their special needs of access to any building, particularly public buildings, is not recognized. And this has been the case until sometimes in 2020, when the Persons with Disabilities Act itself had to be amended to make it mandatory that public buildings have to have an access by persons with disabilities, and that is when you saw many buildings in town being adjusted at least to accommodate wheelchairs and stuff. So basically, the new code, as you'll come to see, is dedicating a whole chapter on persons with disabilities, and their needs are very well catered for. Again, the code as it exists does not contain measures to deal with climate change. The whole concept of green buildings, the whole concept of designing buildings to take advantage of climatic aspects to save energy through that. The green buildings element, the experts are here. I'm sure they are going to expound on this. It does not take into account this. Again, this is taken care of in the new code. Another important area which is the code is silent about is the whole question of building professionals. Every time you are constructing, there is an architect, there is a civil or structural engineer, there is an electrical, mechanical engineer involved somewhere, there is a quantity surveyor, and so forth and so forth. These are the component of the key professionals in building industry, and the code does not seem to provide them with clear mandates in terms of how to go about it. But the new code now makes it clear that if you are developing a plan, if you are coming up with a building plan, it has to be done by a professional. If you are doing something that is related to technical aspects of the building, it has to be done by a professional, and therefore their roles and mandate are clear in terms of that area. The code also does not protect building owners against professional negligence of the constructor. In other words, there is something called defect liability, period. And the new code actually recognizes that once I engage you to construct a house for me, you're supposed to give me a period within which you'll be responsible for any liability that may come to that building within a given specified period. Not to just construct a house and go and tomorrow it cracks and then I'm left with no alternative. What the new code provides for is that there will be a defect liability period where the technical people are going to be liable for any fault that may be occasioned in that building, and that provides some kind of mandatory warranties. Again, if you look at it, it lacks provisions relating to disaster management, all those. This was talked in the morning, I don't need to evaluate it. The question of floods, the question of earthquakes, and I'm sure this is being dealt with by professionals and it will come out very clearly. And finally, it does not also make provision for key aspects, including obvious things like parking spaces. You can imagine, it doesn't talk about providing parking spaces. It doesn't talk about issues of glazing, refuse disposal, even landscaping. These are things that are internationally provided for in building codes, and even in the International Model Building Code, it provides for this. And our new code now has been able to cater for these gaps, as you'll be able to see. Therefore, continued implementation of this obsolete code has again resulted to a number of secondary problems that include low technological uptake and failure to expose stakeholders to international best practices. In other words, the continued application of these obsolete provisions do not encourage technological innovation, particularly using our natural materials, and also affording our people international best practices. Every time someone is constructing an hotel, the first thing they think of is to import a container containing all essential things. Some of these could be developed in this country using our own materials, and therefore these are the things that we are encouraging. There is also a lack of standard monitoring and evaluation framework. Once you build a building, it's like that is done and it is left. So we are providing a system whereby there's going to be constant monitoring and evaluation, not only of the construction action itself, but also of the buildings, even after they have been finished. Inadequate capacity for enforcement of standards. Again, building inspectors are few, and that is why sometimes you see a building collapse at the 6th floor by a defect that is associated with its foundation. Why would it be left to grow to 6 floors in the first place? It is because we don't have people who are enforcing these codes. And therefore you let someone just build until that time that you realize later that the building is not occupiable. There's poor quality works, which has resulted in poor workmanship and substandard materials, lack of sustainable construction, the whole question of green building designs to take and to address the effects of climate change, and also to take to address the effects like it is in our country, that we have a country where we have different towns with different weather patterns. There are odd towns like Mombasa, cold towns like Nyahururu, Nairobi, and so forth. I mean, the building should be responsive to these climatic factors. Low completion rates of construction. There are so many projects that you see they were started and abandoned at some time. And this can be associated to use of this obsolete code because it has no timelines. Once you start constructing, you can go to sleep for 30 years and come and continue your building. The current one has timelines where you start construction, finish by this time. If you don't, you have to start it all over again. I mean, all these things are addressed. Poor practices in safety and good earth management, inadequate access to affordable project financing. You can't believe that it also affects credit financing because of certain aspects about that code. Lack of harmony in policies. We lack essential policies. We have gaps in our laws and regulations that need to be addressed. And some of these are what are being addressed by this code. Unethical conduct and unfair business practices. We have heard of situations where someone is building a story building and the thickness of the floor between third and fourth is like an envelope. It cannot support the weight. I mean, even by look of the eyes, you can tell this is not sustainable. And these are some of the things that we are addressing in this, and hopefully avoid unethical and unfair businesses. Again, lengthy procurement procedures, because sometimes you have to actually import some of these materials. In terms of legal and policy framework within which this code is being developed, it does first of all recognize that the Constitution in the distribution of functions between national and county government, it recognizes at the fourth schedule, the Constitution declares that housing policy is a national government business. National public works is national government. Health policy, disaster management, and the general principles of land planning and coordination of planning by counties. All those are national government business. When it comes to county governments, they are also given their mandate in terms of county planning, in terms of a number of other things that they require to do. County planning, there is the whole question of, I'll come to that, but even including matters to do with actual housing, development of housing and so forth, gas reticulation. You see, these are things that relate to building, construction, and so forth. They relate to the county governments. So both levels of government have actually a constitutional mandate to make sure that the building or the construction industry is affected effectively. National Housing Policy, Sessional Paper number 3 of 2016. This is the policy that the government put in place, expecting to actualize Article 43 of the Constitution, which of course provides every person with the right to adequate housing and reasonable standards of sanitation. All these are taken care of into the code. It also intends to arrest the deteriorating housing conditions countrywide and so forth. We also have a draft construction industry policy that is in place, and we are hoping that it will be finalized and adopted as a policy. It again creates a well-coordinated and developed construction industry and addresses the needs of sustainable socioeconomic construction industry in the country. At that level, then there is also the laws that I've looked at the policies at both national and county, but then there are the laws within the context in which this code is coming. One of these is the National Construction Authority, which is the mother act to the code. The physical and land use planning, again, this is a national law that applies to all matters to do with the planning. The Standards Act, Cap 496, this is the act that provides standards for nearly everything we use in Kenya. If we talk about a door, you go there and you find the standards are set in that particular act. And therefore, it has a lot of impact in terms of what we are doing. There is an act called Occupational Safety and Health Act, the one that deals with safety of occupants. Urban Areas and Cities Act, and finally, Occupiers Liability Act. These are some of the primary legislation which have been analyzed in the RIA, and I'm not going to go through them in detail. If you look at the actual RIA, you'll see how they have been analyzed and how they relate to what we are doing. In terms of public consultation, again, I did point out the fact that it is a requirement under the Statutory Instrument Act that whenever you are developing a proposed statutory instrument or a RIA, you should first of all be able to consult the public, particularly the people who will be affected by what you are doing. And if you look at the chapter on public consultations in the RIA, it does analyze and document how this process has been done right from the onset of developing the first draft regulations up to now. So many people have been consulted, including ordinary citizens, professionals, stakeholder, industry players themselves, businessmen, ordinary wananchi, scholars, and the consultation has been wide along the counties and so forth. Otherwise, the documentation is there and it will be provided. And even when this was done, the government ministries, the relevant government ministries, of course, including Ministry of Transport itself, and its agencies, Public Works, the Construction Authority itself, which is the host, but it has a lot of expertise in this, being the player. The county governments themselves, Ministry of Lands, Physical Planning, National Land Commission, construction industry players, all these were consulted in their individual and professional capacities, and the reports were made. Once that was done and a draft RIA was made, there was also a newspaper advert inviting all and sundry to make their input into the documentation which had been put in our website. And the results of that, of course, again, is well documented. I don't need to go into quite many details in terms of that. One of the important, or one of the reasons why ARIA is done is to assess the economic, environmental, and social impact of any instrument, so that once you establish that instrument, or once that instrument gets implemented, you are able at least to give an estimate of how much money we're implementing the code. And in our case, of course, it is easy If you look at the documentation, you find that there is the budget, annual budget of the National Construction Authority, which will be used for purposes of enforcement and the development of the framework to ensure that it is run efficiently in terms of more than 1.5 billion. There are county related budgets in each county, which they set aside for purposes of implementation of the code. All these are tabulated, and you can be able to tell, even if not in exact terms, by estimation, how much the country will incur in terms of full implementation and making sure that the code is going to be implemented. The cost does not just relate to money. There are economic advantages, there are economic benefits that also come to this, not necessarily in form of money, but in terms of spurring growth of industry, spurring employment, spurring utilization of natural resources, and so forth and so forth. These are things that are analyzed. There are also environmental costs and the benefits, depending on how it is going to be implemented. There are environmental costs, benefits in terms of a well-planned building as what is called built environment, as well as the costs that come with it. If of course, sometimes it might mean that some buildings may need to be collapsed if it is going to be implemented well. Then there is the question of health and safety benefits that accrue to the community in terms of how people are going to get advantage in terms of living in well-planned and well-constructed houses. All these are analyzed, and we are also in the process of getting even better statistics for purposes of enhancing that chapter. If supposed to aid decision making, there are certain there are certain alternatives that were considered, and because I mentioned them, I don't need to go to them in detail. Granted, just to say that we considered the option of doing nothing, letting things stay as they are, and we avoid the impacts, and we have seen the damages that are likely to occur to us. That option has been dropped because it is going to take us into more problems. We avoid the option of self-regulation, in which we expect the fact that because there are industry players in this industry, we ask them to self-regulate themselves, and the government takes the oversight mandate of looking at how they do it. But again, after analysis of this option, it was felt that building industry is a very critical industry, and any mistakes in it have been very costly to the country over the years. And taking into account the recommendations of different committees, as was pointed to you, we were of the opinion that if a building code has to be enforceable, it has to take the form of law. And therefore, option 3, which is promulgation of the code as proposed, was again weighed, and our recommendation was that that is the best option because it tries to address some of the problems that have been identified, and also takes into account international best practices. And apart from that, as was pointed out this morning, it has a provision that it will be revised after every couple of years, so that if there would be anything that arises, we will not have to wait for another 50 years before it is rectified. So it is a document that will be living, and a document that we'll be borrowing from our experience. Finally, based on all this analysis, and based on the fact that we are using an outdated 1968 building code, the analysis in the regulatory impact assessment has arrived at a conclusion that a national building code must be styled in form of a law which is enforceable with clear consequences for non-compliance or for breach. And therefore, noting the fact that through the Business Laws Amendment Act of 2020, the National Construction Act was amended, and the National Construction Authority was given the mandate, the legal mandate, to be able not only to develop these regulations, but also to enforce them. We are of the opinion that the regulatory, the national code as proposed is proper, and the conclusion of the regulatory impact statement is that the national building code as proposed be adopted. I want to thank you for listening.
Thank you, Peter. Let's appreciate him better. At this juncture, let's have the presentation on the draft National Building Code by the chair of the committee, Professor Robert Truquaro. And I know at some point he'll be calling upon his colleague, Engineer Shama Kiteme. Prof.
Thanks a lot. All protocols observed. I'm going to present the building code. I hope all of you have read it. And what you'll be going through is just a brief presentation of the same. And as I start, I think it's important to recognize that different members of the committee, different committees, have worked very hard on this document. This document is built from what my colleagues have said earlier, the Motiso Commission report, and also the report that was put forward by the Review and the Harmonization of Planning and Building Laws and the Regulation Committee, which also worked very hard. And it is that document that they produced that the Building Code Finalization Committee picked up and actually finalized. And today we have an opportunity to validate that document. Many of you have been involved in the process, or indirectly or directly. I think the other committee that came in place along with this building code is the integration of hazards map into the National Building Code, which was led by, I chaired the committee, but we have Kenya Meteorological Department leading in one aspect of the wind and the rain. And also we had the mining and petroleum and mining ministry, which was reading in seismic maps. And I think towards the end, they'll be presenting. So I think that's important to note, that there are committees that has been working very hard towards this end. The other thing that I just wanted to mention is that the document you are looking to is dealing with building control, is dealing with the standards. It's a technical document, and that's why most of the administrative issues are actually vested in the planning and land use act. So you should look at this document as actually standards. What are the minimums and maximums required for building issues that we deal with when you are designing, when you are constructing, when you are maintaining, and so on. So let me go directly to the actual code, and the thing that it talks about is the purpose of the code. I think my colleagues have talked about it. It is really intended to deal with the issues of safety, the issues of health, the issues of convenience of whatever you are putting up, and also the issue of safety and security of the building. So the next part is, which we have already looked at, is the scope of the code. It has also been mentioned by different presenters, and basically, just to emphasize, this code is concentrates on the whole process of construction. It talks about planning on the site, it talks about design, it talks about construction, it also talks about maintenance, and also extends to talk about disaster management in the buildings. So basically, these issues have been touched, and we don't need to re-emphasize. The next thing is that the code is laid out, as I've said, in different sections depending on these processes, and some of these aspects which you'll be discussing, you can actually see is from preliminaries, where basically we really outline definitions, the scope, and all that. And then the next part is siting, parking, and so on. And all these parts is what we'll be going through, each of them in brief. So we don't need to go through that because we already discuss it. So the next thing is preliminaries. When we talk about preliminaries, which is the first part, it basically gives us the definitions and interpretation of terms. I think most of you have seen that's where the professionals are defined, different parts of the buildings are defined, and all terms relating to building in terms of detail, in terms of design, construction, and maintenance, they are all defined. They are all applicable relevant words that relate to the building are very well defined. Then the purpose, I've already cited it, and the scope, I've already cited it. Then we come to the siting and space about the building. As I said, we start by planning, but as you know, we are talking about a building within a plot, so already the planning issues have been resolved. And the things that we are more keen on is it describes the siting of the building. It also talks about the issues that relate to the health and the safety of the user as we try to site the building. It also stipulates the compliance as required in the planning requirement. As you know, when you read the code, there's somewhere it talks about development plan. It talks about plot ratios, plot coverages, and so on, which are very well stipulated in the title Ds when we actually refer to documents that we use when we are designing. It talks about frontage, obstruction of view, and also talks about how we ensure that no obstruction happens to a building. We can cite one of the clause there that talks about a building shall not be erected in a manner that reduces the quality of light and air available to another building which has been erected in accordance to this building code. I think all what we are saying here is the planning the planning requirements have to be met so that you don't contravene this clause. The next part is parking. I think parking, as it has been said, this is a new part that really comes out very clearly on the dimension of cars, or the spaces that they require, the ratios of those cars vis-a-vis the users of the plot, and it also talks about the minimum requirements for ramps, and it also talks about the parking recommendations and how you accommodate different types of cars, may it be lorries, may it be saloons, and so on. And I think that's very critical. It also talks about barriers that are very critical, especially where you have ramps. The other part is preparation of construction sites. I think this is another very important part of our building code. And here it's more concerned with this site safety. It talks about unstable soil. It actually gives a table on different types of soils that you have on the site, and actually the level of eroding those soils can have, and how you can manage those type of soils when you are constructing, especially buildings that have a lot of eroding on the ground. It talks about the issues when you are constructing, the issues the contractor should take into account, issues like noise, issues like dust. And I think here is where we said that OSHA regulations comes into play, because it gives more details of how the contractor should control some of these aspects. And NEMA have come up with also standards for noise and dust levels within a site. It also talks about kitchen and sanitary facilities as it relates to the hashments or the contractor's shelter that he puts for workers. And I think that really helps in control on the safety and the health of workers at the site when the construction is taking place. So you can see that we are concerned with the site management and its health, and also we are concerned with what will be constructed. And this is part of the construction and what goes on during the construction. And basically here is a clause that probably we should not contravene. And this one is before the erection, alteration, scaffolding, or demolition of a building, the owner of the plot on which the building is located shall erect a fence, hoarding, or barricade to prevent the public from entering the plot and to protect the public from the activities at the plot. Basically, I think that's something you are very familiar with, that all sites should have hoarding, really to protect the pedestrians and passerbys and so on. And actually, it gives you a lot of details, even the management within the site, to ensure that the safety of the workers. The next part is the building materials. I think this one has been elaborated a lot by my colleague who was talking about regulatory impact assessment issues. And I think what we are saying is that all materials that we use at our sites must pass through Kenya, the Kenya Bureau of Standards, all the materials that we use there. So that one has really been emphasized in the building code. So there's a chapter that really elaborates on how we should deal with materials that we use for construction. Then also the other thing is that it considered the circular economy, and we are very keen on really going for materials that are very innovative. So a clause that is very important to consider is used materials shall only be used on construction works if the material meets the performance requirements of the corresponding standards of the material issued under the Standard Act. I think what you note about this code is that at every beginning of every chapter, we first give a principle of how we should meet that requirement, or it explains why that requirement is very important. And I think this is one of them, that we must always look at the performance issues that guides the requirement where it will be used. Then the next is the structural design. This is an area that also probably Kiteme, my colleague, will be presenting, who is an engineer. We will really try to emphasize. And this is an area that really we have borrowed from the international standards. just to ensure that we are within compliance of what our other colleagues are doing as professions elsewhere. And since this code, like the Euro codes that have been stipulated here, we have given a lot of details about them and where we can refer. And what you note about this code is that it's a reference document, because if you could put everything in this document, it would have been very large. Already it's too large, about 342 pages. But so most of the aspects, actually you see that some of the chapters is just referencing the relevant legal documents that exist in different jurisdiction or different authorities. So, so the other aspect that is important also to consider is that the structural design shall comply with the requirement of limit stress design, and that the excavation that is more than 3 meters shall be designed by a civil engineer. May I note here that we also emphasize that geotechnical survey will be very critical for buildings built for stories. And we have found that some buildings have collapsed because of failure of foundations. So we have really considered the actual problems that caused the need to actually go to revise the building code. And I think one of them is collapsing buildings, and I think this one now is like a codation. Then a clause that is important to consider is that a design of structured system shall be prepared by a civil engineer. As we said, now we are very specific in terms of whose responsibility in carrying certain actions in the design process. It may be the architect, the civil engineer, and the other professions who are part of the design team. Then we talk about space within the building. This is the external part of the building, issues that are critical. And basically here is going by the planning regulations that or the requirement. This basically is within the building now. Sorry. So basically here the emphasis is that the height of the building should be 2.4 meters. We have given illustrations such that the structural part of the building is not part of the height of the building, because that can have, it's not part of, it can have a ceiling. Then the minimum space requirement for rooms is stipulated, like the kitchen, we have given the minimum requirement for inhabitable space, 7 meters squared, and so on, the toilets and so forth. So it really goes into the detail of what will be required to be done by the architect, for example. Then a clause that is also important to note is that the minimum dimension of landing, lobbies, and passage shall not be less than the width of the staircase to which it leads. I think that's something that we need to note. Then the parts of the floors. The floors, we know that floors start from the ground, and we are very conscious of the type of soil that can be there, and that what should happen to such type of soils, and what the structural engineer must consider. In some cases, they are saying we can remove that part of soil, or we suspend the building. And I think those are some of guidance that the regulations are trying to give. The requirement also, we have to consider the issues of fire spread through the floors. So we have also given how we can stop that to happen. A clause that is important to consider is a floor finishing detail shall be non-slippery material and shall be approved by the architect and the civil engineer supervising the project. So some of these things, they are just being emphasized, but there are a lot of details in the other parts of the clauses. Then we have the walls. I think all of us are very familiar with the walls in the building. And walls start from the foundation, and there are different types of walls. There are foundation walls, retaining walls, and road-bearing walls. And they are very well discussed in the document, and why they are required and why they are not required in certain aspects. Then we have talked about a rain penetration test for the walls, and since we know the walls really are the ones that keeps on, there were a lot of weather effects, so it's well discussed how we should control. Then we have talked about materials that are being used materials that should be used and should not be used when you are constructing, like hollow blocks, should not be used in structural walls. Then the other aspect that is also important to note is that a contractor shall construct a wall that shall resist the penetration of water into any part of the building where it may be detrimental to the health of the occupants and duration of the building. I think that's a principle that we should always conform to. Then part X is lighting and filtration. This a healthy requirement, as we know, about flow of air in the room and also the lighting in the room. And clear statements have been given and guidance when you are designing using natural lighting, and also when you are using natural penetration, or when you are using artificial penetration, or you are using artificial lighting. It's quite well discussed. Also, a lot of discussion goes into energy efficiency buildings, as we have talked about renewable energy, as my colleague have talked about sustainable buildings. This has been covered a lot and discussed, and that's the direction actually we are going in terms of new professions to satisfy efficiency in the buildings in certain respects like energy. Then we have also talked about the issues of lighting of rooms, and very clear, like the last statement, a room shall have a means of lighting and ventilation which shall enable the room to be used for the purpose for which the room is designed without detrimental to health and safety and causing nuisance. I think that's quite well. And we have given the thresholds for different types of spaces. Then towards the end, for my presentation, is glazing and cladding. This is a new area that has been covered since most buildings have been noted to have a lot of glass. So we have discussed the type of glasses, the thickness of glasses, and how those glasses should be supported, especially in taller buildings with steel frames and so on. All that is given, and if it's well checked, it will really help. You have also talked about the more issues or solar radiation issues that affect the building, and we have said what should be required when it comes to the type of glass and its thickness. Then there's a clause there which is also important to consider, that the supervising architect or civil engineer shall receive from the specialist manufacturer a warranty that is full thermal movement safety check has been carried out related to unbroken area of glazing. That means the only person who can assure us some of these things is the manufacturer. So sometimes we have to hold the manufacturer responsible of the materials they are sending us. And this now comes into play when we talk about KEBS, who actually have to approve that material before it comes to the market. Then the last slide, I think this is the last slide that I'm going to present, is about staircases, lifts, and escalators. As we know, we have vertical circulation in buildings, so we really need to make sure that that vertical circulation is adequate for the purpose, especially for lifts, where we are talking about assisting disabled persons and so on. So here we have discussed about the heights of building and also the staircase. And here the staircase, we go to the detail of different type of staircases and their dimensional requirement. The same case with the lifts, the same case with the escalators. And what is of importance here is the issue of handrail, the risers, the treads, because they create the whole comfort of use of space. And then clause 94, a building which exceeds 1 story in height shall have at least one staircase to access the upper floor. All buildings shall have a means of escape in case of emergency, as may be required by the intended user of the building. Otherwise, thanks a lot for listening. That's where I'll reach my presentation. And as we conclude, it is our prayer, as the PS said, that we look at this as a milestone, and that the much you have done is within the threshold of something that can actually change and transform our construction industry. So we look forward that we will validate this document after 26 years of working very hard, and I think you'll be very grateful to all of you and to ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Chairman and CA Board and CA Board members, the Executive Director, the committee members led by Professor Truquaro, and the various bodies represented here. I'll continue from where Professor left, Chairman. And the next part is part 13 on roofs. But before I go there, Professor Truquaro touched on the structural design aspect. And this is a very important part of this code, because it should be very clear to us that while buildings may fail architecturally, buildings literally collapse because of structural integrity issues. I am privileged to have taken part in investigations of a couple of buildings that have gone down, and structural engineers will tell you they failed because of structural aspects. And so provisions in the code provides for the standards for design, and Kenya Gazetted Eurocodes, the year 2012, and a Gazette Notice number 13048 of 14th September 2012. There are provisions for the laws or actions to consider when you're designing, provisions for seismic, wind, and other aspects to consider for building structures to be safe. And the codes, Eurocodes from Eurocode 0, basis of structural design, 1, actions on structures, design in concrete, steel, composite structures, timber, masonry, aluminium. All those are stipulated in the code. But Chairman, as I move to part 13 on roofs, the code provides provisions and considerations for design of roofs. There are provisions on waterproofing standards. You and I know that when you have flat roofs, you're likely to have water retain and the water breaching the roof. Minimum slopes are provided for, and the waterproofing standards expected to be met. Design, construction, and fixing of structural roof components, details are provided. And we just highlighted part 238, class 238.6. It talks about a timber roof truss, rafter beam or wall plate will need to be fastened down and connected to its means of support by built-in or cast-in galvanized steel strap or steel wire bolts or other proof means. This basically talks about stability of anchorage of a roof truss. Very critical provisions for structural engineers and practitioners in the industry. Chairman, part 14 is on water services, drainage, waste disposal, and stormwater. There are provisions on rainwater harvesting, and this is very critical. There are provisions on plumbing, and plumbing that separates gray water and black water. We're in the era of sustainability and sustainable development goals. Recycling becomes very important, and separation of gray water and black water becomes key. And in this manner, the code is very much alive to SDGs. There are guidelines for the discharge of objectionable contents like sewage, provisions for wash closets and appurtenances are also provided for. And like you'll see in the schedules, there are provisions for the minimum number of WCs pegged on the population you're talking about. And so you will realize that in the code in this chapter, there are conversations about conservancy tanks, septic tanks, soak pits, but much more, because there are new technologies for on-site wastewater treatment, like MBR, MBBR, SBR, and others. There is information on hydraulic loads for drainage pipes and pipe sizing, and this is provided even in the schedules, very important for mechanical engineers. There are actually guidelines on design of sewers and appurtenances and correct referencing of the guidelines that civil engineers would use for such design. We have highlighted paragraph 347, and that should interest you. The presentation is basically a highlight, and it's hoped that you can access the code and read the details in the website. Chairman, part 15 talks about electrical installations, and I've seen Engineer Francis Mpiti. He was part of this committee, and this chapter talks about standards for electrical installations. Electrical installation work in a building shall be carried out in accordance with applicable laws. Standards that are expected to be met are provided or to be complied with. An electrical circuit and sub-circuit shall be protected against excess current, and there are means of achieving this, circuit breakers and others. There are provisions for protection against lighting and siting of power houses. We have picked paragraph 316, which says means shall be provided for the immediate disconnection of voltage from a circuit, sub-circuit, or apparatus for the sake of safety. Chairman, there's a new chapter in this code on landscaping, which was not in the last code, the code that we are replacing. And there's a provision on landscaping, and this was really championed by AAK. And the landscape design considerations are provided for. Construction on an environmental reserve is restricted to approval. Setbacks for trees and shrubs are provided for. There are provisions, like highlighted there on paragraph 333, that an owner shall maintain the soft landscaped area after the completion of construction works. Furniture and fixtures shall also be incorporated to the landscape design. Chairman, part 16, not really 17, talks about inspection and maintenance of the built environment, a very important provision that was also included. Now, you realize we design buildings for safety, functionality, economy, and sustainability, reliability also. We categorize buildings, especially under Eurocodes, with the importance of the building. A residential building is attached to some importance compared to a church hall that is supposed to accommodate 3,000 people, for instance. And there are consequence classes. And so inspection and maintenance of buildings becomes very important, because buildings have collapsed because really they have not been maintained. And you saw a building collapsing in US the other day, killing almost 100 people. And it was leading to maintenance issues. So provision for inspection of a building every 5 years has been provided for. There's actually a procedure for building inspection. And there's several types of inspections that are anticipated. They're actually mentioned. Full structural civil inspection, full condition survey, full building services inspection, and specialized building inspections. And this has been heavily contributed to by Dr. Catherine Kariuki. I've seen her here. So an inspection of a building shall be conducted every 5 years. That has been provided for under clause 335. Part 18, Chairman, is on non-waterborne waste disposal. And this talks about siting, construction of pit latrines. And the details are provided for. But the practice manual for sewerage and sanitation services is actually referred to And this is a manual prepared by Minister of Water and Irrigation in 2008. And as a practitioner, I've relied on it in design of sewer reticulation with stabilization ponds and other mechanized systems. Paragraph 341(1), a closet shall be constructed with a floor, walls, and a roof, and the closet shall have a door. And other details are provided for provisions for WCs and other non-waterborne waste disposal. Chairman, I proceed to part 19 and talks about refuse disposal. And every building shall have approved means for refuse storage and disposal. This is very important because waste management has different layers. You want to think about waste segregation. You want to think about the entire supply chain of waste handling. And so every building shall have approved means of refuse storage and disposal. This is very important. And the details of storage chambers and containers are actually provided, and the provisions regarding chutes, hoppers, and incinerators are provided for. Paragraph 351, a service room containing an incinerator shall be separated from the remainder of the building by fire separation that has a fire resistance rating of at least 2 hours. These are very important provisions, and especially if you work in industries, tannery industries, for instance, and hospitals, incinerators are very key. Chairman, part 20 talks about provision of for people living with disabilities, and I've seen members of this body. And the committee considered it very important that provisions for differently abled people are considered. And all buildings shall be planned for use by people living with disability. This includes an access with no stairs, steps, curbs, steep ramp, door or doorway that would impede a passage, wheelchair, or access by a person living with disability. We have actually referred to the ISO standard that touches on people living with disabilities. A lift shall be provided for every floor to facilitate access by people living with disability. Paragraph 352, a building shall be designed in a manner that facilitates access to the building and to the use of its facilities by a person living with a disability in accordance with KS ISO 21542, which talks about building construction, accessibility, and usability of the built environment. Chairman, part 21